Hi, I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler, and welcome to today's video of Industry Insights. I'm very excited to be speaking with Jill Stuber. She is the food safety coach. Welcome, Jill.
Well, thank you, Darin, for having me on today. I'm excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. At my heart, I'm a food safety nerd. And I say that because I've been in food safety forever. And it's because I like the challenge that comes from figuring things out and investigating and helping support people to have better food safety practices and organizations. And I came upon this path because I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. So I have always been working with food. I have always been in agriculture. And that just really carried through with me as I went into college and was figuring out what I was going to do with my life. So after being in food safety for about 20 years, one of the things I ran into in my career was having support to lead better in food safety. And that's really what sparked having the food safety coach start as a business.
Well, that's awesome. I have to admit, I have been in food safety for a long time, like yourself, and I would have to admit that I would consider myself to be a food safety nerd. And um, the last good number of years, work in academia, part of what I do is advising, career advising, literally consulting with companies, and really providing a different set of eyes, a different set of perspectives. But year after year after year, it's amazing how many people I talk with one on one that just really want to get another set of opinions in terms of what to do with their career, and it's an incredible challenge, and I'm sure incredible amount of work that you do and in your role as a coach now.
Yeah, it's really been exciting and fun because when I originally started, I saw it going down one path with really helping people just be better leaders. And just along that path, people come to me and say, well, I'm not sure where to go next, or I'm stuck here, or what could this look like? And so as a coach, my job really is about how can I create a space for people to explore and be curious on their own. And it's really on this principle that everyone already has all the knowledge they need inside, or they know where to find it. It's just tapping into that. And so that's really what I do with people so that they can find something that aligns with what they love and really speaks to their values and beliefs.
Well, to use a sports analogy, you can love a sport, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, and being in front of the TV equates to, or being in the stands equates to understanding the rules of the game, if you will, to be a successful player in that sport. And I would imagine that a lot of that comes out of what you do. You have a passion for food and for food safety. The people you coach have a passion for food and food safety, but to understand the various laws and rules and protocols and regulatory compliance elements and policies and traceability and transparency and technology. I bet that becomes a situation where there's so many different topics that you consult with people about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of what draws people to coaching because like most things we do, we start with a picture in our head of what something will look like and what it will be like. And in food safety, we have the same thing. But then all of a sudden, we start finding that there's all these other elements related to doing this type of work. And before you know it, you look back and you go, am I doing the part that I'm really good at? Am I doing the parts that I love? How do I navigate through this? Not only from a personal standpoint to find kind of what lights you up, but even when you think about as a professional, like what are the areas that you thrive in and that are your strengths so you can really contribute at the level that you want to.
Was it possible to have a career mission, a career view and priority of food safety, and then you have an employer where you work in food safety, but their values, their mission in regards to food safety is not aligned with your career mission and perspectives about food safety.
Absolutely. I think that's where people definitely feel some of that inner struggle because that creates some friction when you hold on to beliefs and values that are kind of your compass and your true north, and to be in a relationship, whether it's working with a company or with somebody else, and have a different set of values and beliefs that are presented to you can cause friction. And so that's an area that we actually even walk through together in some of my programs, because it's really understanding what are people's beliefs and values, what's an organization's beliefs and values, do they honor those beliefs and values, and how do you work within that, or how do you adjust for that?
Well, I want to take a deep dive into this idea of the FDA Model Food Code, which it's essentially it's been around since 1993. It used to be revised every other year. Now it's revised every 4 years. And even though this comes from the FDA, it's actually put together by a conference of representatives representing academia and industry and regulatory and representing different states. And they put together these recommendations to be put into play for the new version that comes out from the FDA. But it's called a model food code because it's not actually, the law that comes down from the FDA. It is simply, here's this model, and we want the states and the various jurisdictions. In some places, it may be a city or a county, or a military base, tribal reservation, etc., that needs to adopt this into their own policy. And the reality is that today we have some locations, some jurisdictions that have versions that are over 20 years old, some that don't even adopt all of any year's policy. They kind of pick and choose what they want to adopt. And there are some states who have the most recent, the 2017 version of the food code. Um, and by the way, right now, the what would have been the next one has been delayed a year because of the pandemic and the work that got
Mm,
into that. But it is a model. It is a generically applied food code that's supposed to bring in the best of insights from industry and academia and regulatory and science and try to put forth a policy. But some criticize it as being almost impossible to be this one size fits all.
mm,
That what works for the traditional, what works for the historically defined retailer, um, may work. But we have so many different versions of retail and restaurant today, and it becomes very difficult to say we can make this fit in this new disruptive model. This new
mm.
version that's out there to capture people's attention. Um, so let's take a look at this. One question I want to start off with is, just from your experience, either within the industry or as a food safety coach for the industry, how does this either vague or inability to have the perfect fit kind of a policy impact the leadership that you've interacted with, or the role that you have played?
Well, sometimes it can just create a lot of chaos, to be honest. So we like having expectations so we know what to work towards. And whether it's something that has been passed into law or not, we recognize that there's always an intent the behind what's going into effect. And so when we have something like a food code where it's trying to cover everything, but yet it can't because it doesn't evolve as quickly as the industry. And so then it creates some gaps. And especially as you mentioned, if it's adopted by some states and some jurisdictions in part or full, then that also inherently just creates gaps in what you're doing as an organization to build food safety programs. because typically an organization will say, well, we want to make sure we're at least meeting all regulatory requirements. That's kind of the base to play. And then hopefully there's many organizations out there that say we actually want to do more than just the base regulations. And so even in those different perspectives, that can also create just some variation in how one organization approaches regulatory requirements and the intent of what they do versus another one. So, as a food safety professional, sometimes you can get caught in a spot where there's a best practice, but if it's not a regulation that's been passed, it may not be able to generate support within your organization solely on that merit. And
Mhm.
so it will take a food safety specialist or manager to really look at another perspective on perhaps managing brand risk or other risk the organization may face to drive to that next level of best practice.
Well, does it complicate the scenario you describe when, let's say, you're a major regional or national chain, and it's almost as if every zip code you have a facility in falls under a different level of regulatory, um, you know, compliance issues. You have a different version as adopted here in this state,
Mhm.
or literally in this county within the state. And it's does it make it difficult to have this idea of one corporate mission, one corporate plan, if you will?
In theory, it shouldn't, because in theory, an organization should be able to set an internal set of standards that incorporates all of these other regulations or requirements into their own. So regardless of where they're making or selling food, it would comply with all of those regulations. But that's not always the case. Sometimes an organization starts in one jurisdiction and they know those really well on what they need to do. And as they start expanding, if they're not as intentional as they can be about understanding the regulations in those other jurisdictions, sometimes that creates that gap that we talked about earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would imagine if, let's say, a required temperature in one state is this, and a required temperature in another state is that, or a required audit compliance piece is this in one place, it's that in another place, or you know, different kind of. It's not even as easy as to say, well, pick the most strict elements, and if you address those, then everything else will come into play. Because it's also trying to meet the needs of that inspection or that audit, which may be different in every location,
Mhm.
um, and very difficult, I would imagine, in terms of mobility. If someone's trying to move from working for a franchise or working for a one facility to work for a regional or even a national level when it comes to um, the executive leadership, it becomes more and more complicated.
It does. And most of my experience is probably more at a federal level. But even within that, when we make product and we intend to sell it in the United States, that seems to be pretty clear, at least from one set of standards, like through USDA. What happens though is product can be bought up by brokers or other people and then sold into other countries. And as a manufacturer, you're still responsible for meeting all those regulatory requirements, regardless of where your product's being sold. And so that's kind of this high level of how do you stay on top of all of these regulations and build that into your product. So that's very similar to what you can see at even a local level of making sure that you're really staying on top and understanding what those are, because product will begin to shift outside of where you normally thought it would be sold.
It almost reminds me of either A, like when you're in high school and you're writing a paper, or B, looking at journalism. Where you are um, is not the only question.
Mhm.
What is the commodity? where are you, or where are you, and where is it being sold? How is it being sold? Is it table service? Is it delivered? Is it picked up? Is it mailed? Is it,
Mhm.
you know, um, why? Why maybe like this is kosher certified, or it's organic, or things like that. Why does the person look for that specific certification? Who is the actual company behind this? That there's a lot more. Um, there are much more levels of specification that we have to get into today in order to deal with compliance. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I would imagine that you and I could both look at the world of the consumer 30 years ago and assess that there's a lot of questions that weren't being asked
Mhm.
3 decades ago that are being asked today by consumers.
Yeah, it's a different world. There's, different foods that people like and different needs among consumers. So whether it's, preferences like genetically modified or gluten-free or allergens or, you know, not even just characteristics about the product, but even about the company in terms of sustainability and some of their policies. And so there's a much broader sense of what a consumer is looking for. They're not just buying for that product in the package as you see it. There's usually the buying decision is based on a whole lot of other factors that maybe are articulated or not. And so understanding what those are can be part of that challenge.
Do you think that that idea of trust and trust between a consumer and a company, or brand reputation, is much more of a challenge today than it was 25, 30 years ago?
Hmm, that's a great question. Of course, my perspective years ago is really different. So, speaking about that from today, I would say I think there's definitely some questions about that trust in those relationships. And I think that's why there's so much more that people can see through social media and websites and just different marketing channels that tell them more about an organization. And while we know that's what the organization presents for us to see, people are longing, I believe, for what's beneath that. Like, is what we see really what happens? Does that really represent the beliefs and values in that organization so that when I buy this product, I feel like it aligns with what I'm doing and I'm supporting a bigger cause and a bigger and a larger purpose?
Well, I think too that, in a very generic statement, when I was a kid,
Mm.
assuming that Honey Nut Cheerios, I don't know the timeline, but assuming that Honey Nut Cheerios existed when I was a kid, if I went to the grocery store and I wanted my parents to buy Honey Nut Cheerios, the question I would ask is, what toy is inside,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Today, people are asking, is there real honey in Honey Nut Cheerios? Are there real nuts in Honey Nut Cheerios? Is the nut an allergen? Is you know there's a lot of other questions that consumers, and whereas when we were kids, the idea of asking those questions would have been seen as, who asks those questions? Today, those seem like completely normal questions for consumers to ask. Um,
Yeah, it certainly is. And, along those lines, it's interesting because I have 12-year-olds. And the other day in health, they were talking about nutrition labels. And so I've never had my kids ask me before about what's in their food, but it started a new conversation about, Mom, did you know these bars that I eat have 18 ingredients? And so the conversation has changed. Like you said, they didn't ask about, was there a toy in the package or like what's cool about it. Now we're actually talking about what's in the food that I'm eating. So it's a real shift in those perspectives.
well, I think too, another shift that's been there is when you had, um, let's say in the 60s and 70s, all of a sudden you had these frozen TV dinners.
Mm.
and you had these boil in a bags, and you had all this new frozen stuff that could be cooked in the microwave. The biggest concern was the idea of you're it's going to be the same thing as if you made it yourself from scratch. The turkey and the gravy and the mashed potato and the peas and the little peach cobbler or whatever in the frozen TV dinner. That you're going to get those flavors. You're going to get that there, kind of a thing. Whereas today, it's not so much about is it replicating it in this different version. There is a concern about that idea of, am I getting the right nutrition, the nutrients I'm looking for? Am I getting this value out of it? And perhaps a problem with it is that, you know, again, this might make me sound old, but food costs more. And perhaps, I mean, I know the cost of living is more, but food does cost more than it used to, and people are trying to make sure they're getting what they paid for, I would assume. But what's interesting here is that everyone that you consult, everyone who you coach in the food industry, is also a consumer
Mhm.
and may have families that are consumers. And so it's like this dual life. This You look at it from the consumer perspective, and you look at it from the industry executive, leader, supervisor, whatever perspective. And that's got to be this weird shift in terms of looking at mission statements and priorities and transparency and things like that. Do you experience a lot of that where people are conflicted about some of these issues we talk about?
I would say yes. And I think sometimes it's posed as, well, I know too much. But really, it's because we know more of the background on how the food is made or where it comes from, or just some of the other factors that go into it. I wouldn't say it's that we know too much because there isn't anything to hide. But I think we put our food scientist or our food safety hat on and we analyze it from that perspective where we say, well, it meets all government regulations, it meets this, it does this, it whatever those things are. And that certainly isn't how I would perhaps be making purchasing decisions for my family. And so I think there is sometimes that dual perspective of here's what the scientific or technical part says is happening or tells me to believe, but then here's the emotional part and this other perspective as a consumer that I also can lead with.
One last question with the food code. Um, and again, just like regulatory compliance in general, um, my perspective has been that in the past it was a few specific individuals within a company that focus on regulatory compliance, and that today those who play a role in that responsibility has really expanded. Are you seeing this as well?
I've seen multiple ways that's set up. So I would say, in a sense, there is more awareness around regulatory requirements. And so people in other functions besides food safety and quality or regulatory, they know these things exist and know that they have a part in it. I think what still is the most common is the details of what that means and how it rolls out within an organization still sits mainly with the food safety quality function.
I want to focus on the idea that even with um, rules and laws and regulatory compliance elements, um, we see where there are those elements, and there are examples of companies and individuals that meet those needs and go above and beyond. But unfortunately, there are those situations where we find that even though they exist, people make the decision to not follow those or to not be ethical in how they follow those. In recent years, we have seen the two highest federal fines imposed on food companies due to failures in food safety. We've also seen the most significant jail sentencing in federal prison for guilty charges on federal felony crimes related to failures in food safety that resulted in illnesses and deaths. And in every instance, it's not exactly as if an awareness about compliance did not exist or the means or vehicle for compliance did not exist. But what did exist is perhaps a gap in ethics or a level of corporate social responsibility. And so, what I want to talk about a little bit is this idea of, what it is, especially from someone, the perspective of someone who coaches people. I'd like to hear some perspectives on corporate social responsibility and ethics from someone who coaches individuals within industry. So let's start off really simply. What is corporate social responsibility in your eyes in terms of an industry perspective?
Oh, that's a great question, Darin. Whether I'm thinking about corporate social responsibility or anything that an organization does, I think it's really about leading with values and integrity. And so to me, those are the parts that are embedded in everything they do and the decisions they make, regardless of perhaps the outcome when it comes to a financial outcome. It's doing the right thing, regardless of what that looks like, because it's the right thing to do.
Sometimes you may have, and you've alluded to this in other conversations, you may have a clash that exists between an individual's level of responsibility, corporate social responsibility,
Mhm.
ethics, and that of those around them.
Mhm. That definitely exists. And, part of it is, how do you navigate through these conversations so that you can understand, are we on the same page? Do we have those differences? And it takes more than just, hey, Darin, do you believe in this the same way that I do? It takes deeper conversations. And often that means people need to build relationships and trust to be able to do that, to fully understand, is this what will play out in these different situations? And so I think we can get to a spot where we're not sure how to navigate that. And we may have a strong desire of what the right thing is, but if we haven't had the conversation with another person on our team or organization, that's where some of that uncertainty about, are we aligned, comes into play, and can then be seen as, or we've seen these outcomes where it doesn't always come out with the decision that we would personally want to see.
Have you ever recommended to an individual to look outside of their employer for guidance or network or mentorship or coaching uh, on this issue
On this specific issue,
or a similar issue?
they're so like woven together, but I do always recommend, like, find a network, find people outside your organization that you can bounce things off of, because within an organization, right, we have group think. And even if we feel strong in our beliefs and what we're doing, just being around other people, we gradually will come to some group think on topics, even when it comes to food safety. And so having a check and balance outside your organization, I think, is really important.
Well, along the lines of checks and balances, there's this idea of the carrot or the stick. Do
Mm.
we incentivize ethics or do we punish the lack of ethics? Or has there got to be both there because perhaps not all participants would view one versus the other the same as the next person?
That's another great question, because of course we'd love to always lead with the carrot, right? And be proactive. And what that looks like, that's where those conversations that go more than just the surface, so that you can really get below and understand, like, are we aligned when we say we will always comply to government regulations? Does that mean always? What if I have one ingredient out of order on my label, but it's not an allergen, it's only functional, it's likely to have no noticeable difference, but it is not in pure compliance. And those are conversations that I encourage people that I work with to have, because those are the ones that when it comes down to the wire, whether it's that or something even more serious, those are the ones that you want to start having those scenarios ahead of time to say, how would we handle this? What would it look like? What other information would we need to know? Or who else could we ask to have another perspective?
Do you think it's weird? I'm thinking of Chipotle, for instance, when you had after the outbreak, you had the CEO, one of the executives. He might not have been the CEO. Anyway, you had one of the leaders at Chipotle um, during the outbreak earn his $15 million Christmas bonus because it was tied to profit. It wasn't tied to things along the lines of preventing ethical failures or making unethical decisions or taking unethical actions. Do we need to, if we were owners of stock in that company, or something of that nature, do we need to say no, the ethics needs to be part of that evaluation?
Well, I can only speak from my perspective, but I would say yes, because if we keep rewarding behaviors that don't align with the integrity that we want to see, we will only get what we reward. And so, if in that situation, we will still put profits over other things. And as humans, we are wired to want to win, and whatever that means for us. And so, if somebody says, hey, if you have this much for profits this year, then this is what your bonus is, we will inherently work towards that. So we also have to have compelling enough metrics and goals to be able to work on alignment of our values and ethics and food safety and all of those other parts that, you know, maybe aren't as savvy and sexy as profits, but they are more important than making that dollar.
Well, sometimes making that dollar though, if we look at let's say a 1% increase in quarterly earnings of stock value, right? Kind of a thing. But it was done through a lack of ethics, kind of like sports, unsportsmanlike behavior, whatever. And we lose customers, we lose some of our brand reputation. It might be difficult to put a dollar value on that loss kind of a scenario. But if we don't have these conversations in terms of um, you know, when does it become ethical? When does it become a conflict now that is beyond simply, yeah, but we increased our profit. Okay, but you did it the wrong way. Um, Someone's going to find this out. Someone's going to be impacted by this. Someone's going to change their level of trust and again reputation. With this, it could be there's not a consumer. It could be a supplier. It could be
Mhm.
a distributor. It could be who's retailing our products. I don't want your product on my shelf anymore because you did this, and I don't agree with that. And that could have a longer term economic impact than one might
Absolutely.
predict.
Well, I find it really interesting, and I wish I could recall the author's name, but I'm reading a book right now called Culture Renovation. And it really speaks a lot about the evolution that they're seeing on boards where they're beginning to understand that you can't just look at those metrics like profit, that you really need to understand, like, are team members engaged? Are they getting growth and development? Do they have meaningful work? What do these other factors look like? Because we know those drive everything else. And so hopefully that will be something that elevates as we go forward in business and also spreads across other organizations to look at some of those other metrics so that we can keep our eye on some of those prizes and the things that are the carrots versus the other things that we know can detract away from that.
Sometimes in our careers and our lives, we have this intersection or this overlap, like a Venn diagram overlap
Mm,
of different hats that we wear, and we can see things differently. Um, as a professor and having been an assistant dean, I've often talked with students who got caught plagiarizing a paper, and when I
mm,
ask them why did they do this, it usually comes down to I didn't feel that I had all the support, all the resources, all the tools. I didn't have enough time, and I waited until the last minute, and so I saw the importance of this, and I was going to get it done no matter what, and so I decided to do this. Then take off that hat and put on the food safety hat. When I look at when were shortcuts taken, when was there
mm,
a breakdown in what might be seen as an ethical decision or taking additional steps, it usually kind of comes down to the same thing. I didn't have enough support, I didn't have enough
mhm.
resources, I didn't have enough time to do this. So I think perhaps there may be a message there for leaders. What would you say might be the takeaway that leaders need to think about in terms of those around them and the ethical decisions that they take?
Well, I've never been a fan of overarching metrics because while they provide some information, they often hide a lot of information as well because it's that law of averages. You'll always get a number that probably fits in the box unless it completely shifts. And so I think as a leader, you have to be willing to go dig deeper and find out some of that information that goes into those numbers. Otherwise, it creates this false sense of security that things are on path or on track. And if you do happen to see something that tells you you need to like get back, on the road and get out of the ditch, usually it's probably more severe than people are letting on. But that's also goes back to how do you build that culture of safe space so that people can truly trust and share. And so they actually go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah, I can see that. I want to end by asking you your opinion on this idea that if a lack of ethics or a lack of corporate social responsibility doesn't happen by accident,
Mm.
is it possible to say that ethics and corporate social sorry, is it possible to say that on the same eh, let me s- I know what I'm trying to say. Um, how about as we close, I'd like to get your reaction to this idea that I have that if one could say that a lack of ethics or a lack of corporate social responsibility doesn't happen by accident, that perhaps the same thing could be said by the existence of ethics and the existence of corporate social responsibility. It just doesn't magically happen.
Oh, absolutely. I very much agree with that because anything that happens is related to our intention and where we put our focus. So if we put our focus, it takes the same amount of energy to focus on building ethics and corporate social responsibility as it does to go the other way. It's just that whether or not we perceive it as putting effort in or not putting the effort in. And so it has to be intentional, no matter which way we're going. And sometimes the path, perhaps forward because we don't know it as well as where we've been, seems like more effort, but it's still effort, regardless of where we're going.
Great. Well, Jill, thank you very much. I think this is one of those things that we could talk about this at great length, but it's always going to be something that
Mhm.
takes on new challenges and new examples and new insights in terms of what is ethics within this sector or within that capacity. What is corporate social responsibility? Um, this old adage of I don't know what it I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it. Unfortunately, when we know it when we see it is usually when it goes wrong, and perhaps we need to know what it looks like more often when it goes right.
Well, and along those lines, we are kind of at an exciting point where some organizations, some new companies that are starting are building their foundation on corporate social responsibility and ethics. And so I think it's really exciting to look at how will that shift the culture and how that company moves forward compared to companies that perhaps haven't had that strong of a guiding light and are also trying to move everybody along those lines. And so it'll be really interesting the next couple decades to see how this works and what it shifts into.
Yeah, imagine trying to sell your stakeholders on the idea that you made incredible gains this quarter because of the ethical decisions you made, even though your profits didn't increase. That's typically the reverse of what you would think someone who owns, an interest in a company would want to hear. But if your business model is made on doing it the right way is job one, that's maybe what more people will take away from these new examples of companies that this is their entire business model.
Mhm.
Great. Well, Jill, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me again, Darin. It's been great.